There's a story in the Babylonian Talmud about two rabbis, Rav and his student Rav Kahana. One day, Kahana is hiding under Rav's bed to observe his mentor. He hears Rav chatting and joking with his wife and doing what was required, that is, having sex with her. So here you might stop and think to yourself, who hides under somebody else's bed? What a creep. And if you did think that to yourself at that moment, you wouldn't be too far off Rav's reaction. When Kahana, making his presence known from underneath the bed, blurts out, "Rav's mouth is like one who has never tasted the dish." Here he's probably using a phrase that suggests Rav is behaving excitedly and joyously as if tasting something delicious for the first time. Rav is startled to hear the voice from under the bed, and he says, "Kahana, is that you? Go out, because it's rude." And Kahana retorts indignantly, "It is a matter of Torah, and I need to learn." And there, the story ends. As is characteristic of many of the stories in the Babylonian Talmud, this story doesn't leave its readers with a firm sense of how we should see this issue. What is it saying? Is sex Torah? Something to be studied and then enacted? Even a duty God intended for humans? Or is it something private and carefully circumscribed? Jewish traditions actually pick up on both of these. The rabbis, and here I'm talking about the rabbis from late antiquity, and later interpreters see sex both as a matter of religious importance and also as a matter of privacy and intimacy. Jewish interpreters also pick up on both the strands of pleasure, the joking and the chatting and the relational aspects of sex, and the aspects of privacy that can sometimes, in some moments, border on shame. Jewish texts, interpreters, and practices include both problematic and praiseworthy threads, and which is often in the eye of the beholder. So, Jewish textual tradition centers on interpretation and commentary, and unsurprisingly, different interpretations and commentaries can come to quite different conclusions. From the scholar rabbis of antiquity to the pulpit rabbis of today, variety and disagreement have characterized Jewish discussions about sexuality. But variety and disagreement does not necessitate discord. Since ancient times, Jews have held that even one biblical verse has a multitude of meanings, and then when you put verses together, you get even more meanings. So multiple answers and this tradition of the multivocality of divine text, however, also does not mean that just any interpretation counts as legitimate. So multiple interpretations, but not just any interpretation. Only conclusions that are supported by certain kinds of textual reasoning can qualify as legitimate voices within the tradition generally. So even though answers to particular questions are not always shared, then there's some widely shared Jewish approaches to understanding sexuality. And one of these is to look to Jewish texts. The Bible, Mishnah, Talmud, Maimonides, who we heard about a fair amount earlier today, we'll get to hear a little more of, and even later highly esteemed commentators on these texts. So just to take us on a very quick tour, the Hebrew Bible contains all sorts of stories about people having all sorts of sex. And much of that sex appears, at least to the modern reader, as unethical. The patriarch Abraham twice allows his wife Sarah to be taken into royal harems. Leah and Rachel perform a bed trick to make sure that Jacob marries them both. Semi-divine beings, sons of God, have sex with human women in Genesis 6. Dinah is raped in Genesis 34, and then her brothers kill the men of the city of her rapist. When a mob demands to rape his guests, Lot offers up his daughters instead. Later, after they've escaped God's destruction of the sinful city, Lot's daughters get him drunk and have sex with him. Rape, incest, bed tricks, interspecies sex, and I haven't even made it out of Genesis. Jewish interpreters, though, did not blithely assume that all sex portrayed in the Bible was good sex. Mere inclusion in the Bible should not mean that these actions had God's endorsement nor the community's. Furthermore, and important for us, the Bible has no programmatic or philosophical statement on what sexuality should look like. It has stories, imagery, divine judgment, pathos, and human consequences, but these add up to a very complex picture. So if inclusion wasn't endorsement, and the Bible contained no ready-made, unambiguous statement on sexuality, that meant that Jewish communities would have to interpret the texts to articulate sexual values. Later textual traditions, later than the Bible, interpret sexual values in increasingly systematic ways, but these too show a fundamental complexity, so more systematic, yet not entirely and completely all the way down. With respect to sex bodies, for instance, the Talmud discusses men and women, as you would expect, but it also recognizes the existence of gender non-binary people and bodies. Two of them, the more common two, are called the androgynous and the tumtum. A person, the androgynous is a loan word from Greek, as you can tell, same word that we use for androgyny, right? A person classified as an androgynous would probably now be called intersex. They possess genitals whose appearance include parts associated with men and parts associated with women. The rabbis would classify a person as a tumtum if they had no visible genitals or kind of ambiguous genitals, not the visible both male and female genitalia. These elements, so the tumtum label would include people that we know as eunuchs, or that the ancient world thought of as eunuchs, but they also have a category for people who become eunuchs through accidents and things like that. So today, many of these people would also be considered intersex. Jewish interpreters, however, considered their sex, the tumtum, to be indeterminate. That is, they imagined that the person was either really male or really female. It was just, we didn't know. So you might discover this by an operation or something like that. But the idea is then this person legally will be kind of, we don't know if this person is a male or a female. It's unknown to us. Whereas the androgynous is a person who seems to have elements of both maleness and femaleness. And so the classic version of that is the androgynous is like a male in these ways, the androgynous is like a female in these ways, the androgynous is like neither of them in these ways, and the androgynous is like both in these ways. So we've got these two positions that we would now think of as gender non-binary people, intersex people, and other terms that we have today. Interpreters all recognize these non-binary Jews as fully human, including the fact that they have sexuality. So they're part of the community, they're fully human, and they have sexuality. It's not that they're an aberration and then we want them outside the social system, right? That would be one option for that, but that's not what happens. Talmudic tradition allows an androgynous to marry a woman, and a tumtum to marry either a man or a woman, and all of those marriages, any of those marriages would be halakhically valid. Later interpreters expand on these possibilities. Like, oh, what do they mean by all these things? What about this situation? Rashi, the 11th century French rabbi, explains that if a tumtum marries a woman and then divorces her, the tumtum, and then Rashi uses him, the masculine here, must give her a get or a halakhic writ of divorce. But even as halakhic literature records these non-binary Jews and considers them part of Jewish life, it also assigns them less central religious roles in some instances than those of men. For example, though an androgynous must perform most of the commandments directed at men, they can't be alone in the company of men and cannot share inheritance as a son would. A tumtum must hear the shofar on Rosh Hashanah like all other Jews, but cannot, like a man, blow the shofar to help others fulfill their commandment to hear. So we have a space for them in religious life, but we don't have a space that's just the same as the most obligated Jewish people in rabbinic literature, right? And so they're not equal to men. The Talmud also mentions sexual relationships. So here, this is about, the first part is about sex bodies. Talmud also discusses sexual relationships. Interestingly, it discusses sexual relationships between women, which is a topic not explicitly mentioned in the Bible. A tradition from Yevamot helps illustrate this. So Here's the tradition. Rav Huna said, women who rub against each other are prohibited to marry a priest. And even according to Rabbi Eliezer, who says that when a single man has intercourse with a single woman, she becomes a zonah, so then she's a person who's no longer fit to marry a priest. That is true when the premarital sex with a man, but sex with a woman is mere indecency. That's not the clearest, so I'll help walk us through that. So Rabbi Eliezer rules here that even a woman who has sex with another woman can still marry into the priestly line, which wouldn't be true if she had had sex with a man. Rav Huna disagrees, but I think also really interestingly for our purposes, the text recognizes the existence of these rubbing women, so these women who have sex with women. And while neither approves of their sexual acts, they don't constitute the same kind of severity of violation that men having sex with men does. Men having sex with men is explicitly prohibited in the Bible, and so that becomes a category that the rabbis widely agree is unacceptable, right? We wouldn't have the same kind of conversation about men having sex with men. Here, the rabbis seem to think that women having sex with women, it's not really sex, perhaps, is one thing that we could say is at least one of the positions listed here. But we'll also see the very presence of this kind of conversation allows contemporary Jews to see a history of Judaism that includes engagements with other kinds of sexuality apart from heterosexual married sex. The Talmud and other rabbinic writings demonstrate disagreements and seeming double standards, even with respect to heterosexual sex. So unmarried men having sex with women don't present a halakhic problem. Even married men having sex with women to whom they're not married don't constitute a halakhic problem mostly, though most interpreters think they do constitute an ethical problem. In the biblical text, if a man rapes an unmarried woman and is found out, he has to pay the woman's father 50 shekels and then is married to her without the possibility of divorce. He can never leave her. The rabbis of late antiquity found this wanting, and they declared that a woman who was raped could refuse to marry her rapist. Her dad can also veto it, and so can a rapist. And more radically, that she's also to be treated as a victim of same as you would treat a victim of an assault. So compensation for more than just her virginity, right? The original version, the biblical version, seems to be that the compensation is for her virginity, and that goes to her father. The rabbis are like, whoa, there are lots of things that can happen within a rape. It is in many ways like other kinds of assault, and so she should also be compensated there. As these passages suggest, traditional sources on sex tend to address men. In fact, the whole of the Talmud is a text written by men and intended to be read by men. With few exceptions, men were the only readers of the rabbinic text for much of Jewish history until the 20th century. That's not exclusive, but by and large. This means that while texts like the Talmud present laws and discussions about the bodies and sexualities of all people, they do so from the position of men. So that's a helpful thing to keep in mind. Both the Bible and the Talmud come from and reproduce patriarchal societies. In rabbinic legal material, men can divorce their wives at will, but women cannot divorce husbands at will. Men can marry more than one wife, but women can only marry one man. The Talmud presents the commandment to procreate as a legal obligation specifically for men and not for women. Biblically, adultery is actually really only between a married woman and a man who's not her husband. Married men aren't really committing adultery if they have sex with women other than their wives. We could talk about whether adultery is the right word for that, but there's a difference where it's not parallel. The rabbis describe a long and humiliating ordeal for a woman suspected of adultery, but there's no parallel for men. Women don't inherit from their father or their brother, whereas men inherit from both a mother and a wife. Despite this clearly patriarchal system, scholars and commentators often frame rabbinic conversations, though, as moving in a more progressive direction toward greater social justice, less abuse, and more resources. So thinking about the time from which they come in the ancient Near East, there are good reasons to say that some of these things really should be framed as progressive rather than simply seeing them as patriarchal and dismissing them, right? And of course, if you see this progressive tradition, then that's the kind of thing you, as a later interpreter, can appeal to. Yes, the rabbis were progressive for their time, thus that licenses us to try to be progressive for our time. So one example that often comes up here, the Talmud contains discussion in which rabbis prohibit a man from forcing his wife to have sex with him. So there is such a thing as rape within marriage, and you can't do it. Right, in the US, for example, this wasn't illegal until the 20th century. Once you were married, if you were a man, you could force your wife to have sex with you. Yet, Talmudic tradition has it, Rabbi Joshua ben Levi says, anyone who forces his wife to do the mitzvah, they have a series of euphemisms for sex, will have unworthy children. Rabbi Bar Hinana says, where is it written? And then he quotes Proverbs 19:2. Also, that the soul without knowledge is not good. So here he suggests, it seems, that you also shouldn't have sex with your wife if she doesn't know about it, like if she's asleep or she otherwise hasn't consented, right? So not only can you not force your wife, but that you can't unilaterally decide, now we're having sex, even though you're married. So husbands then should not force their wives to have sex, a position that was progressive for its time, and as I suggested, pretty progressive for a long time afterward too. Yet we have no evidence that there was actually any punishment for husbands who raped their wives. It suggests here that perhaps the punishment would be only in the divine realm, that you might have unworthy children, or something about the children would. There's another pretty unpleasant passage in which we'll see this, where sexual practices that are being disapproved of correlate to disabled children, and it's possible that is a similar tradition to what's going on here. So more specifically, rabbinic writing and subsequent legal traditions present sex between a married man and a married woman in ambiguous ways. So we just saw some about heterosexual sex, and here even within the context of marriage. The Bible valorizes heterosexual procreative sex. Be fruitful and multiply, Genesis says God commanded Adam and Eve, or maybe just Adam, depending on who you're asking. But how and with whom one should reproduce, and if sex has other purposes, remain less obvious. For example, for married men, sex is a duty. The Talmud transmits this tradition about how often men must have sex with their wives. And if you don't know this tradition, it's really interesting how often you're obligated to have sex with your wife if you're a man, according to this tradition, depends on your occupation. So it depends on, you'll see this, how often you're home, right? The times for the conjugal duty prescribed are, for men of independent means, every day; for laborers, twice a week; for donkey drivers, once a week; for camel drivers, once in 30 days; for sailors, once in 6 months. So I don't know enough about the difference between donkey drivers and camel drivers, but it seems like camel drivers work on for longer.
How about professors?
That's a great question. If you wait, we'll get to something about scholars. Yeah,
Depends on the discipline.
Yet an earlier tradition in this same tractate, not earlier time-wise, just earlier in the tractate, insists that sex is also about intimacy. Here's the tradition. There must be close bodily contact during sex. This means a husband must not treat his wife in the manner of the Persians. What do the Persians do, you might ask? They perform their marital duties in their clothes, they say. And the Talmud goes on. This provides support for Rav Kahana, who ruled that a husband who says, I will not perform my marital duties unless she wears her clothes and I mine, must divorce her and also give her a settlement. So if you're a man who insists that we can only have sex if we're fully clothed, then actually you must divorce your wife and give her the divorce settlement, right? So this is not acceptable as far as sex goes, right? So here in this second tradition, sex very much seems to be about intimacy and relationships and pleasure. It's also about not doing it like the Persians. So there is some too, like, this is the way we do sex, it's the ethical kind, it's relationship building. But then we also see the same tradition thinks about ways that it is also a duty. So Jewish commentators also discuss what kinds of sexual acts people should and shouldn't have within heterosexual marriage. Sometimes the within heterosexual marriage is assumed, but sometimes it's not. They'll talk about a wife comes and asks this question. But they don't always agree. Can you have oral sex, for example? Yes, absolutely. No, and if you do, you will be punished with unworthy children. Can you turn the tables? Also, is this women on top or anal sex? Depends on who you ask as far as modern interpreters go. The phrase comes up quite a few times, but you can use your imagination. Seems like it could be either. The answer is yes. Also, the answer is no. Can you chat during sex? Yes, no, depends on what you're chatting about. And also, it depends on which rabbinic tradition you'd like to follow. Later texts similarly demonstrate a range of opinions. Igeret HaKodesh, a 13th century treatise on sexuality that's sometimes ascribed to the 12th century Rabbi Nachmanides, reads, "One should know that sexual union is holy and pure when it's done as it should be, at the proper time and with proper intent." So that's one of these, oh great, it sounds sex positive. It's very much about relationship with a human, which also mirrors a relationship with God. But the 12th century Rabbi Maimonides presents sex more as an obligation, as a pleasurable activity than in many places. For example, he declares that sages, so like scholars, should have sex with their wives once a week on the Sabbath. And he says, the intent of sexual relations is the preservation of the species and not only pleasure. The aspect of pleasure was introduced only to motivate the created beings toward that ultimate goal. He also says, he writes a fair amount about it, so you've got a couple of snippets here, but he also writes, on sexual intercourse, no excuse whatsoever should induce us to mention it or to speak of it. Oops, sorry Maimonides. That was a joke. By the way, he also has an entire section that's discussing sexual practices. So interesting for him to say, the reason some of the people in Jewish history should be really considered holy is because they didn't talk about sex or even think about it. And then he's like, let me tell you about what kinds of sexual practices you should and shouldn't be doing. So there, Pache Maimonides. So I'll talk a little bit about one of the things that we were asked to talk about when we were thinking about the sexuality concept in our 3 religions, was to talk about theological and philosophical principles. So like I said, we don't have a programmatic statement in the Bible. We don't even in rabbinic literature, though we have a lot of both halakha and agadah that are about that topic. So I'll talk about one tradition that makes its way through a lot of Jewish history. Unlike Christianity, Judaism is sex positive, or so goes a common contemporary refrain in Jewish communities. Shmuley Buteach's Kosher Sex, a Recipe for Passion and Intimacy, would have its readers believe that, quote, unlike other religious traditions, Judaism has never had a prudish or conservative sexual ethic. On the contrary, Judaism has always celebrated the commitment that exists between a loving man and woman. This is one reading of the tradition, but in order to make this argument in such forceful terms, you must read selectively and ignore some passages. However, it does get one thing right. Even at their most conservative, Jewish interpreters don't portray sex as inherently sinful. Judaism does not have the tradition of original sin associated with sex, as many Christian traditions do. In Jewish traditions from antiquity to the present, sexuality can be about procreation, intimacy, bonding, affection, or all of these, but it can also evoke bodily policing, embarrassment, and shame. So to draw out these 2 parts, rabbinic tradition introduces a pair of theological concepts, the good inclination and the evil inclination. Sexuality is part of the evil inclination. At first glance, these 2 concepts suggest that humans have a dual nature, good and evil, pulling toward opposite ends. It sounds as though the good Jew would tap into the good inclination and hold at bay the evil inclination. And the tradition does have elements of that. But the evil inclination turns out to be more complex. Bereshit Rabbah, which we got to hear about earlier, redacted in the 4th or 5th century, collects a series of rabbinic interpretations of Genesis. In traditional rabbinic fashion, many of these interpretations latch onto seeming contradictions, repetitions, or strange turns of phrase. Why, the rabbis wonder, does God declare the creation very good on one of the days of creation when it was just good on the others? The text brings several rabbis' teachings about this question, including one by Rabbi Nachman. And Rabbi Nachman says, "Behold, it is very good," refers to the good desire. It is good. I put that in there. It is good refers to the good desire. And behold, it is very good refers to the evil desire. He's using desire, inclination. It's the same word. Can then the evil inclination be very good? That would be extraordinary. But for the evil inclination, however, no man would ever build a house or marry a wife or beget children. So if you didn't have the evil inclination, you wouldn't do these things that are also good. So could Rabbi Nachman have suggested that it was evil for a man to build a house or marry a woman or have children? No, and in fact, elsewhere the rabbis read these as commandments, that it's not just a good idea, even it's required. And in fact, the rabbis suggest that this evil inclination is the impulse not only toward love, sex, child rearing, and house building, but also lots of other creative activities. So with no evil inclination then, humanity would go extinct quickly as humans would die of the cold for lack of self-care and failure to procreate. In this sense, it's not even evil in like the necessary evil kind of sense, but more like an inclination that is good when it's under control and acted upon under the right circumstances. So we have this good inclination, evil inclination thing that at first starts out by sounding like, oh, it's going to be this total dualism, but then turns out to be a whole human, you actually really need both of them. And sexuality is part of the one that gets called evil, but that's also the thing that God created on the day that God declared very good. So evil inclination, very good. Maybe you didn't see that coming. Later interpreters continued to puzzle over this good inclination, evil inclination thing. These two concepts played a significant role in Kabbalah, the Jewish mystical tradition, and in Hasidism, a populist and later pietistic Jewish tradition that drew on Kabbalistic teachings. For example, the 18th century Polish rabbi Moshe Chaim Ephraim of Sadlikov discusses them through a parable. Humans are like the desert tabernacle described in the Bible. Humans and the tabernacle are both grounded in the earth, yet reach above. And both are material, but also contain spiritual potential in their function purpose. Just as the most earthly and common materials were used to build the tabernacle, so the holy abode for the divine presence, so too humans can summon their base nature or their material nature, the nature that pushes us toward material things, to create holiness out of the mundane. So this is both the tabernacle and the person, grounded in the material, but having spiritual aspects. And this is how our 18th century Kabbalistic rabbi is reading the evil inclination and the good inclination. So here, material existence is necessary for spiritual existence, but the latter does occupy a better and more refined place. So there are plenty of other thinkers within the tradition. I just wanted to give you a few throughout history who engage these concepts, but I think they're helpful for showing some of the ambiguity when it comes to sexuality. So now we're going to zoom forward in history. The Reform Rabbi Solomon Friedhoff wrote a Jewish legal opinion in 1973 that Judaism had always gone hand in hand with heterosexuality. Somewhat erroneously, he claimed the opposition to homosexuality was more than a biblical law. It was a deep-rooted way of life of the Jewish people, since biblical times. Yet, in reality, some Jewish men had had sex with men, and some Jewish women had had sex with women, and other Jews had had sex of people with more than one sex, and all of this had been going on in a variety of Jewish cultures. So, one very brief thing that we can see, polygamy was relatively uncommon, yet it still happened. In the 11th century, an Ashkenazi rabbi wrote an opinion banning it, and it seems like that was mostly effective. But it continued in Sephardi communities, and married men still had sex with unmarried women, servants, Jewish women, and non-Jewish women, and those are examples that, those are just the examples of some of the unions we have evidence of, right? It's certain that there are lots of sex acts that left no traces at all. So just this even brief foray into thinking about the history of polygamy suggests something broader about the history of sexuality. And that is, to discuss the history of sexuality, then the sources that we have are more often normative ones that describe how people should and should not have sex. We can infer something about the everyday sexual activities of Jews, but they can't tell us definitively about all of it, right? They're usually normative texts that are telling people what to do rather than reporting texts. Like, here's how lots of people do have sex. Here's how my neighbors have sex. We don't have a lot of those kinds of historical documents. Interestingly, though, historicizing sexuality has been one way that contemporary Jews find religious space for queer Jews today. For example, the Bible seems to prohibit men having penetrative sex with men. It says directly, do not lie with a man as one lies with a woman, that is detestable or an abomination, whatever your translation likes. Yet, many contemporary Jews see this biblical prohibition as a prohibition on forced sex as domination or war crime. The Jewish Publication Society's Study Bible explains in its interpretation of Leviticus. So this is JPS's Study Bible that gives you lots of bits. It's designed for the English reading, practicing Jew to interact with the Bible. It says, this is its footnote for that verse. Biblical and ancient Near Eastern culture was not familiar with homosexuality in the sense of a defined orientation or lifestyle. It acknowledges only the occasional act of male anal intercourse, usually as an act of force associated with humiliation, revenge, or subjection, and then it gives you some biblical examples. It also notes that following the documentary hypothesis that only the holiness source mentions this, and the holiness source also seems to disapprove of all kinds of non-procreative sex. This holiness take, the JPS Bible implies, is just one opinion within the tradition. And it also does this historicizing thing by saying, oh, when you think about gay men today, that's a different issue than this biblical moment of men having penetrative sex. The American Reform Rabbis Ad Hoc Committee on Human Sexuality made a similar historicizing move in 1998 when it declared, quote, that the relationship of a Jewish same-gendered couple is worthy of affirmation through appropriate Jewish ritual. That is, it legalized gay marriage under Reform Jewish law, which isn't really halakha, but kind of follows a halakhic process. You have Reform Responsa, even though the Reform movement doesn't understand halakha as binding in the same way that Orthodox Jews do. So, as that brings us to the present, what do Jewish traditions have to say about sexuality today? The textual snippets that you've seen here will lead you to the right guess. There are a variety of opinions. Many of these opinions can be mapped onto a kind of Jewish denominational map. So I'll speed through this. There's lots more to say about everyone on this map, but you can think of liberal or reform at one end, to modern Orthodox in the middle, to ultra-Orthodox or Hasidic at the other end. So here are a short sketch of questions that matter for practicing Jews today. Who are appropriate romantic or sexual partners? Most liberal Jews would promote monogamous relationships, but the gender and sexual identity of the two partners would have little bearing on the relationship's validity. Although, as we've seen, the Jewish past is not always affirming for queer or trans Jews, it can also provide resources for contemporary queer people to find themselves within the tradition. So the trans rabbi Elliot Kukla writes, Talmudic gender multiplicity provides modern feminists, queers, and trans people and gender deviants a solid connection to another time, space, and community. The tumtum and the androgynous are a resource, not just for destabilizing modern dichotomous sexes, but also for stabilizing wholly new and surprising questions of sexual identity. Orthodox communities tend to prescribe male-male sex in particular, and female-female sex too, although slightly less so, because it's not biblically prohibited, but it's still not okay. And so they often marginalize queer Jewish practice. There was recently a case in the UK about a trans woman whom the secular courts prohibited from seeing her children after a divorce because the Hasidic community made the case successfully that her trans identity was too radical a break for the children raised in that community. That's an extreme case, but it helps us see the kind of spectrum from Kukla's Jewish tradition has all these resources for affirming queer and trans Jewish life to there is in fact absolutely no place such that seeing a trans woman would be something that children raised in a Hasidic environment simply could not understand, even though that trans woman was their father. Okay, so that's a brief moment on who are the appropriate romantic partners. What about what is sex for? That was an issue we saw in some of these texts in the beginning. Most liberal Jews would tell you it's for pleasure, for procreation if that's what the couple intends, and for relationship building. Modern Orthodox Jews would emphasize the procreation, but still lean heavily on a sex-positive narrative for married men and women. Hasidic Jews are more likely to have a mystical interpretation of what sex is and what it's for, and they will lean heavily on the sex on Shabbat tradition that we see the rabbis say is a good suggestion for scholars, so for like Talmudic scholars. What about particular sex acts? Male masturbation is a general no-no for halakhic Jews. But for people who don't emit male seed, it's again one of these things that's not really okay, but also not really a terrible violation. So female masturbation is not the same kind of problem that male masturbation is. Hasidic communities tend to see anal sex and oral sex, and here we do have a variety of opinions even within Hasidic communities, but they tend to see them as acceptable as a sort of foreplay to vaginal sex, for the specific reason that male seed should not be wasted. So you could use oral sex or anal sex as a way to vaginal sex, and then we don't have any male semen that's going outside of the woman's vagina. So that tends to be there is a space for them, but it's a particular space for them. Liberal and Reform Jews tend to have no problem with these practices when they're practiced between consenting partners. Yet the textual precedent for much of this sex-positive stance is, well, not always so entirely positive. For example, a Talmudic tradition says, a man may do whatever he pleases with his wife. So this is about what kinds of sex can you have, except here's the parable. A parable, meat which comes from the abattoir, the butcher, can be eaten salted, it can be eaten roasted or cooked. So with fish from the fishmonger. Right. So the sex-positive tradition that you can have sex as you like it within a marriage is also paired with the what is it like? Your wife is like a cut of meat, or your wife is like a fish. So we have mixed traditions, and you probably wouldn't want to import them wholesale. They're still we can think of them as very much part of a tradition that still requires interpretation. So today's overall picture of sexuality in Judaism is a profoundly diverse one. Yet these variety of positions, that's a funny joke, have one thing in common. No. Okay. An appeal to Jewish texts and interpretations of those texts. And as for us scholars, we might echo Rav Kahana, though not as such creepy voyeurs. It's Torah in the sense of knowledge, and we want to learn. Thanks.